Episode 6, Sold to the Highest Bidder. By the early 1840s, a small settlement had begun to develop in Section 22 of Rose Township. It was located along the main road, which was called the White Lake Road at the time, and it was called Buckhorn Village. Most of the land around the little settlement was owned by John A. Wendell. Wendell had been the first supervisor of Rose Township and had served in that position for many years. In the first government, he was also a justice of the peace and one of the poor masters. In addition, he was the first postmaster of Rose Township. Using a current aerial photo, John Wendell's land would have been located here. And here was the little settlement, located today at the corners of what would be Demode Road and Milford Road, and near the Buckhorn Creek. In 1842, John Wendell had put a dam on the small creek and then built a mill race to a point where the creek dropped about 10 feet, and then a small building intending to build a mill, and finally a tail race back to the Buckhorn Creek. But he ran out of money and turned the small building into a tannery instead. In 1847, John Wendell sold this parcel of land, which included the tannery, to his nephew, A.W. Buell. It seems like Buell ran the tannery for a short period of time. But Len built a hotel next door, and across the street, a little store, and Buckhorn Village was born. In 1849, A.W. Buell sold this piece of land, which included the hotel and the old tannery, to Everett Wendell for $1,000. Everett Wendell was one of the sons of John A. Wendell. The deal also included this small piece of land near the dam. It's unclear what Everett Wendell planned to do with that piece of land. The 1850 census of Rose shows Everett Wendell running the public house, another word for hotel. But interestingly, A.W. Buell is right next door, and he's still listed as a tanner, so it's possible he kept the tannery going for a short amount of time. In 1853, A.W. Buell sold this piece of land, which included the store, to Emanuel Van Avery for $1,000. It looks like Van Avery ran the store for a few years. But then, in 1862, moved into Holly, where he took over the Northern Hotel. By the late 1850s, it appears that the tannery was gone. But these two buildings have a long, long history and changed hands many times. Beginning with Everett Wendell selling the hotel in the late 1850s to James McCracken for $1,000. James McCracken had come to Rose from Scotland. In 1860, McCracken sold the hotel to George Hungerford for just $412. And then in 1861, Hungerford sold it to James Fisher for $1,000. But it appears it was more complicated. According to records, James McCracken, George Hungerford, and James Fisher had formed a partnership agreement to own the hotel together and run the hotel together. But apparently they ran into some financial problems. So they borrowed money in the form of a mortgage from a man named Benjamin Billings. But they defaulted on the mortgage and fell behind in payments. So Benjamin Billings took the three partners to court, and the judge ruled that the hotel and the land it was on were to be sold to the highest bidder at public auction at the front door of the courthouse. How did that work in those days? Well, the three partners had the piece of land in the hotel, but they needed money. So they borrowed money from Benjamin Billings. In return, Benjamin Billings got a mortgage on the land, and the three promised to pay back what they owed him with interest. But they defaulted on the mortgage. So the court ruled that the land and the hotel had to be sold at public auction. The money from the sale of the land was given to Benjamin Billings. The hotel was put up for auction that year in 1866. The high bid was $460, and the high bidder was none other than James Fisher, who was one of the three partners, so he got the hotel back. But he didn't hold on to it long. In 1866, that same year, he sold the hotel and land for $550 to Leland Gregory, who was from Holly. In 1867, 1 year later, Leland Gregory sold the hotel to Julius Stocking for $1,000. Julius Stocking had had an interesting career before coming to Rose and buying the hotel. In 1850, he was working as a weaver in Indiana. By 1856, he was a gunsmith in Iowa. By 1860, he was a farm laborer in Ohio. In 1861, he'd enlisted in the 21st Ohio Infantry, and 1 year later had been discharged with a disability. And somehow by 1867, he was in Rose Township running the hotel. In 1869, Julius Stocking sold the hotel to William Burke. William Burke, however, needed money, and he took out a mortgage on the hotel from a man named Job Cranston. He was a wealthy banker from Fenton. Unfortunately, William Burke defaulted on the mortgage, and once again the hotel was put up for public auction. The high bid this time was $400, and the bidder none other than Job Cranston, who paid himself back for the mortgage and then ended up owning the hotel. But according to the business directory for 1873, Cranston may have owned the hotel, but it appears that William Burke was still running it. That would be about the last year for the hotel, however, and it seems that then it became the private residence of the Burke family. According to the Milford Times, around 1905, the old Buckhorn Hotel, which was now the Burke family residence, was to be torn down and a new residence built on the site. This is the house that replaced the old Buckhorn Tavern. But what about the store? What about the store land? We know that in 1853, A.W. Buell had sold it to Emanuel Van Avery for $1,000. What happened after that? In 1856, Van Avery had sold it to Chester Morris Burke for $1,450. So it's likely there'd been improvements in the store during that time. Chester Morris Burke was the son of Chester Morris Burke Sr., who'd come to Rose in the late 1830s, and for 1 year in 1841 had served as Rose Township supervisor. There were more sons besides Chester Jr. There was Isaac and Ferdinand, who became successful farmers in Rose Township. And there was William, who of course ran the hotel at one time. In 1859, Chester Burke sold the store to George Hungerford for $200. Yes, this was the same George Hungerford who was one of the three partners who owned the hotel in the 1860s. But why such a low amount? Well, it turned out that Chester Burke had 3 mortgages on the store at that time. And the deal was that George Hungerford would pay them off for Chester Burke. But it seems like George Hungerford defaulted on those mortgages, and the store was put up for public auction in 1859. The high bid was just $64, and it was made by John and Arvilla Bennett. The 1860 census shows the Bennetts here in Rose Township with their young son Elmer, and John is working as constable for Rose Township. By 1860, John and Arvilla Bennett had to take out a mortgage on the store, this time from Jacob Van Valkenburg, who was a wealthy lawyer and judge in Pontiac. Unfortunately, they defaulted on the mortgage in 1866. And once again, the store was put up for public auction. The high bid was $179.04, made by a man named Ira Brown. And here's where the story takes many twists and turns. It turns out that Ira Brown was not from Rose Township. He wasn't even from the United States. He was from Canada, from the town of Whitby, which is located on the northern shore of Lake Ontario, far, far from Rose Township. Why did someone living that far away buy the store? Well, it turned out that John Bennett had married a woman named Laura Brown in 1864. She happened to be from Whitby in Canada. Her brother happened to be Ira Brown, which made Ira Brown and John Bennett brother-in-laws. So it seems when John Bennett defaulted on the mortgage in 1866, his brother-in-law, Ira Brown, stepped in to help him out and purchased the store. But wait, what had happened to Arvilla, John's first wife? No divorce record could be found. No death record for Arvilla could be found. No burial record for Arvilla could be found. She just seemed to disappear. But the story gets even more complicated. Because in 1868, Ira Brown sold the store to a woman named Laura Young for $250. It turned out that Laura Young was Ira Brown's sister. But wait, John Bennett had married his sister Laura in 1864. Remember, this part of the story has many twists and turns. It turns out that in 1866, Laura Brown Bennett had married someone named William Young. He was a farmer living in Rose Township. But wait, what had happened to John Bennett? No divorce record could be found. No death record could be found for him. No burial record could be found for him. He just seems to have disappeared. How is it that sometimes in history, people seem to just disappear? Have they been abducted by aliens? Not likely. The fact is, divorce records, death records, even burial records are almost non-existent for the 1860s. So sometimes people just seem to disappear. In 1870, Laura Young sold the store to Samuel Sampson Baker for $650. Samuel Baker will own the store for the next 40 years. So that's a much simpler story. In the late 1840s, Samuel Baker had come with his parents to Rose Township. They had come from Rose Township in Wayne County, New York. There were other families who'd come to Rose Township, Michigan from Rose Township, New York. The Kraft family, the Skidmore family, the Fuller family. Those three families had settled around Rose Corners. In 1859, Samuel married Phoebe Howland. She'd grown up on the farm right next door to the Baker farm. They're shown here with their young daughter, Mary. Mary was the only one of their four children to have survived. Three others died young and were buried in Rose Center Cemetery. It appears that Samuel never ran a store out of this building. Instead, he used it as a private residence. This is what the building looks like today at the corner of Dumode and Milford. Over time, features were added to the building to make it look more like a family residence. But if you look at the building without those features, it looks very much like the general store that was built in Waterford in the 1850s. Phoebe died in 1904, and Sampson continued to live in the building that had once been the Buckhorn Village store until his death in 1910. They were both buried in Rose Center Cemetery next to their children. A hotel and a store. Did Buckhorn Village ever have any other kind of commercial business? Well, it turns out in 1857, Van Dyke Wendell, another of John Wendell's sons, bought this little triangular piece of land for $150. He'd been running a blacksmith shop at Rose Corners, but decided to move down the road to Buckhorn Village. And he opened up his blacksmith shop on the little triangle piece of land that he had purchased. Blacksmith shop and land would pass to his son, Carlisle Wendell, who himself was a blacksmith, and he would run the business up until the early 1900s. What happened with Buckhorn Village? Why hadn't it grown any bigger? Well, it turns out that by 1871, the Holly, Wayne, and Monroe Railroad had been built through Rose Township. And the commercial center of Rose, which had been at Buckhorn Village, moved down the road to where the railroad tracks crossed the road. And Rose Center was born. But what was Rose Center like? And what was happening in the rest of the township? Stay tuned. There's more history to come.